Cool. So yeah, John, thanks for having me. Um, I've been fairly interested in starting to talk about and write about and share some of the experience I've had building high school sprints programs. Um, just reflecting back on the last 10 years and particularly like the last 8 years, because I started coaching predominantly high school athletes, and then I coached those athletes through into university and saw a little bit of success with those athletes. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized this is really what I enjoyed doing, was bringing the high school level athlete up to a collegiate level and seeing them through their collegiate career. And it wasn't until I started to think back on what I actually did that it started to kind of make more sense to me. And it seemed like there's maybe some principles that came out of that, um, along with a bit of research that I did. I think there's some cool things to be learned and shared here. Um, if anyone has a question at all during this, just there's only a few of us here, so don't hesitate to just speak up or turn on your audio and ask the question. Um, yeah, so like I said, a lot of this has come from me reflecting on my past and particularly the last few years. And for those who don't know me, I live in Halifax and I coach at Dal. I'm also one of the coaches at Halifax, and I competed as an athlete at Dal. And towards the end of my career, I started getting interested in coaching, and I transitioned immediately from an athlete to a coach. That first year when I was done, it was about 2012. And then I just started to coach high school athletes. A few athletes started to train in my group, started to, experiment and try things on them. That evolved. I got more athletes, continued to try and experiment on things. And then, as I continued to experiment and gain experience, there was a little bit of success that came along with that. And I just wanted to share a few photos here that kind of culminated in, the last little bit. We're having some success at the youth sport level. Here's a photo on the right here with Matt Coolin, who's probably, the premier example I'm going to talk about throughout this presentation. Another athlete, Maya Reynolds. Maya's from Ontario, and I only coached her in university. Whereas with Matt, I coached him since the grade 10 level. So it was really cool to see him come all the way through here. And I just added a clip here of the 2019 U Sport 60-meter final. Yeah, so that was a really cool moment for me. That was actually the second year in a row that Matt had won the 60-meter sprint final. He set the Nova Scotia record in that race. He set the Dow record. And it was really cool to share that with him, having gone through the high school years and come all the way to here. And so, sorry. It really all started in the high school years. The foundation for future success is set in those years. And what you do and what you don't do as a coach really helps to set up that athlete for their future. In this photo here is a great example. 3 of the best high school sprinters in Nova Scotia competing against each other. And, they've been around for the last 5 or 6 years now and have seen a lot of progression. So, I'm going to talk about 4 distinct things today. I want to talk about how do we define a successful program? Like, what does that mean? I want to talk about recruiting. How do you start if you don't have a group or if you don't have talented athletes? Where do you start? Where do you begin? I also think it's really important to understand the why. So why are athletes choosing to do track and field? Why would athletes choose to do sprints? What keeps them motivated? What keeps them involved? And then we'll talk about training and progressions, the real meat of track and field, and it's the training content, right? So how do we define a successful program, right? And I think if we go through our levels, we might talk about LTAD, and the concept of LTAD, long-term athlete development, is to do the things early on that set athletes up for success in the future. And the LTAD is a really great model. This is not a talk on LTAD, but it's very specific to the physiological basis for development. So you want to do the right things from coordination, development, speed development kind of area, to make sure that you're always kind of progressing in the proper path. But I wanted to reflect more on what I thought the characteristics of a successful program were, more as a symptom, less as a cause of the LTAD. So if you do the LTAD really well, I think this is what you observe in that athlete, right? So the first, characteristic to me is that athletes move on to healthy competition and they enjoy competing. I've seen a lot of high school, programs and environments be really stressful on athletes, less enjoyable, and they really don't enjoy competing. And I think that's a real shame. And I think it takes some athletes out of competing, which when you look back from a senior or university level, the importance of a high school competition, it's not that important, and building it up to be something that's, the be all end all is, it puts a lot of stress on the athlete. So I think, very successful programs instill a sense of fun and actually improve how enjoyable competing is over time. And the next characteristic that I believe of a successful program is when an athlete transitions to a new group, right? So if, sometimes there's athletes that go from one coach to another at the high school level, or they're going from high school to university, or for whatever reason, there's a transition of coaching. I think that should be an easy transition for athletes. And I really see it as a role for me as a coach or as a high school coach to make sure that the coach themselves isn't the limiting factor in that athlete. So you really want the athlete to be self-reliant, and you want that athlete to be easy to work with, right? Which leads right into the next characteristics, which is easy to coach and respectful. It's kind of a hallmark of your ability to coach an athlete is it's not only the training that matters, it's the attitude, it's the way that they come to practice, it's the way that they treat others in the training group. And I think the best groups in the world, instill a sense of respect and coachability, right? So you don't want to coach an athlete who just won't listen to you, or who doesn't respect the level of coaching that you're delivering on them. So I think that's a hallmark of a really great program, if you can deliver that. The ability to collaborate with other coaches too is a sign of a successful program. So as a coach, talking to other coaches, asking them for help, trying to develop yourself, being humble, being open and honest with people, not knowing all the answers, but trying to look for them. And I think the best coaches in the world exhibit this quality. And then at the very last characteristic, in my opinion, is that athletes continue to improve later in their career, right? So the high school competitive environment is not necessarily, it is for some, and not everyone progresses past this, but the athletes that do should continue to kind of flourish beyond that. It shouldn't be the pinnacle of their career are these high school seasons. So, it's a lot to think about. And the really interesting thing is I didn't say anything about speed, right? Not the fastest athletes doesn't mean you have the best program. It's a whole bunch of things that are somewhat unrelated that will come together to make sure that you have the best program. Excuse me. So, yeah, just something to think about and continue to think about is, that everything around a program influences the output. And for a long time, I predominantly would think about, just the training content. And it's not until later in my career that I just started to think about, building athletes as people and trying to instill these other characteristics that'll help them be successful in life. Now, in order to have a great, successful group, talent is important. And I think recruiting is a thing that we maybe undervalue in general to build a great group, right? And, Gerard Mock, this is Gerard Mock. He's a Polish. He was the head coach of Team Canada back in the 70s. He invented the mock drills, the A skips, the B skips, the C skips, the drills that are very popular in track and field. He was a very outspoken individual. And in Poland, he would put an ad in the newspaper. He would say, track and field camp. If you make this tryout, we're going to a training camp in Italy, and the top 100 people will come and train. So naturally, he'd get a lot of interest. And, out of all those people that would come to try out, he would take the top 100 and do a training camp with them. And, the point he would try to make is, if you have 100 athletes, like 100 of the best athletes that you can recruit, and you have at least one person, in this situation, it's male sprinters. If you don't have at least one male sprinter that can run a 10.6 in the 100 meters, you're a terrible coach, right? And so, I've always thought about this, that statistically, there are great athletes around us. Sometimes we just don't take the time or put the effort into finding those athletes. I think about Dal all the time, and Dalhousie has over 10,000 students. And, we are on the track team, there's maybe 50 athletes. On the sprints team, there's maybe 12 athletes. On the Dal campus, somebody's faster than our best female sprinter, probably, right? Just from a statistical perspective. The same thing from our male sprinter. These people exist out there. So, when I was coaching high school, having a high school group, what I would tend to do is, in the club environment, we had a lot of athletes come in and out. And so I would set up our timing gates and time pretty much every young athlete that came through Halifax. Every athlete, throwers, jumpers, whatever, all ages. And so I just developed over time a keen sense of just recruiting the fastest athletes, and paying a little bit more particular attention to making sure that those athletes are exposed to track and field, because at the initial stages, their commitment's not very serious. They're attending practices, they're in different groups, it's not a very structured thing. And so I would reach out and target the athletes that were faster and provide to them more structure. And doing that over time helped the group grow into a pretty solid and more higher performing group over time. And I think this concept can apply to any high school group, because in a high school there's many sports. So you got to think, who didn't come to track and field tryouts? I think it's a bit of a mistake to wait for people to come to you. I think we need to be a little bit more overt and go to people, go to the athletes, go to the other sports, test athletes. So how do you recruit these athletes, right? And like I was saying, you have to look, you have to go and find people. You have to kind of be, put some effort into it a little bit. You have to build some benchmarks. And for me, I was lucky I had access to some Brauer timing gates. And so I had really robust benchmarks for, the first 30 meters acceleration and like a top speed measure, like a flying 25. And so I had a really good understanding of if an athlete was a bit of an outlier in one of these two categories. But, you can build your own very easily. You can with a stopwatch. So, I wouldn't recommend timing 100 meters because I think it's a little far, which sounds crazy, but, at an untrained level, 100 meters is a lot of speed endurance. And you're really trying to isolate for the athletes that have the best acceleration or the best top speed. And so, a 50 meter would probably be the most relevant indicator for that. And, I would, if a stopwatch is the only piece of equipment you have, hand timing 50 meters is fine. It's more than fine. And just building a good repository, understanding what those times mean over time. The environment needs to be a good fit too for these athletes that you're recruiting. If you recruit the best football player and they're fast, but the environment is, not good enough for that athlete to progress, the social environment isn't appropriate for that athlete, any number of different reasons, that there's a mismatch between that athlete's expectations and what that environment is, I think it's another missed opportunity. We'll come back to this a little bit in the next slide here. But I think it's really important to understand, like, why is somebody choosing to be a sprinter? What motivates a person to be a sprinter at high school level, right? Like, how do you get into that? How do you stick to it? How do you develop a love for it? I think it's really important to understand why. So I did a bit of research, and this is just a part of me, reflecting on the past and trying to understand what motivates athletes. Like, why does an athlete choose to do track and continue to do it and do it on their own and invest, 10 hours a week or more into this? And I found this great paper. It's a European researcher looking at the different factors associated with motivation. I won't take a super deep dive into these, but they're here for just your information. Social reinforcement. People want to know that they're good, or they want to compare themselves. Fringe benefits means like perks. Like, I get a free backpack. I get to, miss school to go and compete. These are kind of the fringe benefits. Fame and fortune, that probably won't happen for a majority of athletes. Athletes want to prove themselves. I actually bolded the ones that I thought were a little bit healthier reasons to be motivated to do track. And, the social benefits, it's a great social environment, make a lot of friends, it's good for your brain. You express yourself. I think self-expression is such an interesting motivating factor when you look at athletes, especially in the digital era, because everybody's posting to Instagram and Snapchat, and they're expressing who they are, and they're trying to show people that, this is me. And when it comes to track, it's really about building an identity around your sport, right? Some people are basketball players and they live and breathe it, and some people are soccer players. It's important to understand what makes a person identify as a sprinter, right? Sense of accomplishment is incredibly important in sprinting, and a self-enhancement. And that is so critical. We're going to spend a bit more time talking about, improvement. Why are people trying to do track? You just want to be the same speed for 5 years, or do you want to see some incremental improvements? So it all plays into this motivational landscape. So the way you program influences motivation. And it's something that I've only really started to reflect on recently. If a high school program, only trains for 3 weeks prior to the high school meets and then trains and then competes at the high school meets, there's a certain amount of motivation that'll occur in those 3 weeks, and then it'll be gone, right? And what we're trying to do, and what you're trying to do as a coach, is instill a greater level of motivation, a greater level of excitement in the sport and in the performance of the athlete. And so, I think having more opportunities to improve, which means longer competition seasons, right? And when I mean longer, I don't mean really long. I'm just talking, my reference point is 3 weeks of high school competition, right? That's kind of it. In a year, you get 3 weeks of competition. So, thinking about ways to extend that. Hey, the end of the track season, it doesn't need to be June 1st or whatever high school provincials are. There's other track meets. There's indoor track too. Longer preparation cycles. And again, this is coming back to, when I mean longer preparation cycles, I don't mean super long. And I've got some charts later that we'll kind of take a quick look at, but longer than 3 weeks. The better you train, the better the athlete will get. That will be a motivating factor in and of itself. I always found that meaningful travel opportunities were motivating because they offer very social environments, and it doesn't have to be far. It could be 2 hours away. We can go to Moncton or Fredericton or PEI. Those are fantastic opportunities, and they provide a lot of motivation because, athletes will go to these competitions, they'll have fun, and they'll want to do it again next year. They'll want to have that kind of fun more often. Realistic goal setting is really important in high school, especially. I find that there can be a huge mismatch between what the athlete expects of themselves, right? So if they think that they're going to run a super really fast time and that time doesn't materialize, or it's completely unrealistic, that's really unmotivating, right? And it could be a personal best of that athlete, could have been a great performance, but if it doesn't match the expectations, there's a decrease in motivation there. And I especially think that talking about how performance is influenced by the environment, meaning wind and electronic timing, is one of the most important conversations to have with a high school athlete. And it's pretty much where I start from day one. If I coach a high school athlete, I say, what's your PB? Well, tell me a PB. I'll say, okay, when did you set this PB so I can look it up? I look it up. Was it hand timed? Was there no wind gauge, right? Is it some ridiculous, time? Because hand times are always faster. Obviously wind aided times are also always faster. So especially in the sprints, this is the worst in the sprints, because in 100 meters, those two factors can make a half a second difference. It can make 0.7 of a second difference. And the amount of time it takes to improve 0.7 of a second could be years. And so you don't want that to materialize to, well, my PB is 10.3 and I just ran 11.4. That's hugely unmotivating to an athlete if they don't understand what the actual performance is. So it's just a subtle nuance that I think is really important to understand. these things. Um, you know, your training environment, making sure it's fun, it's enjoyable, people, respect each other. Recruitment matters again, because if your athletes, especially in the male population, don't have anyone in their kind of class or in their speed realm, they're going to look for the competition in training elsewhere. And so I think it's really important to the athletes in your group to maintain a quality training group and to kind of continue upon that. So another good, output from this is, the best recruitment strategy is consistent results, right? And so if your group, if you're, all the athletes in your group on average tend to get better year on year, significantly, even if they were slower than other athletes in the next year, they're faster. A lot of athletes are going to be like, well, what are you guys doing? What's really unique about that group? And I think training content is something that's really important to look at the high school level, because it can hold athletes back, and at worst, it can actually make them more regress. And so as a high school coach, and this is going to sound really crazy, I recommend being a lazy coach. And we'll get into what that kind of perception means. It's not actual lazy coaching, it's the perception of being a lazy coach. So, the content of training is really critical as well. We talked about a lot of social factors and motivational factors and recruitment strategies, but what you do really matters. If if the training is not producing results, athletes are going to get frustrated about that. They're going to lack motivation. And so, the place I always start with trying to explain, especially the type of training that I delivered in high school with high school athletes, is a bit of this lazy approach, right? There's the elite program that university and above and older athletes will do. When you compare it to that, this program looks lazy. This type of program looks lazy. And I think it's absolutely essential in high school that that approach is utilized to a certain extent, because it takes a lot of pressure off the athlete, gives them a lot of room to grow, and progresses volumes and intensities really, really slowly. And it starts with the understanding that the high school competitive seasons aren't the end all be all, but somewhere in the future, that's where you want these athletes to be at their best. So, it starts with an understanding that the basis for sprinting success is acceleration. And the majority of your time should be spent building acceleration. And this might mean that practices feel short in time or aren't physiologically hard, which means you're not hitting lactic acid, you're not tapping into deep endurance reserves. You feel kind of fresh when you're done a sprints practice that's based in acceleration, right? Now I'm talking about pure sprinters here, like 100, 200, and for high school athletes. And to a large extent, my philosophy actually does go up to the 400. I've coached a lot of 400 meter athletes in high school. My approach with 400 is probably even lazier, because we barely do any speed endurance work, and I let competitions take care of that. That doesn't mean that in the future, when they get to university or grade 12, they don't necessarily need to do a lot of speed endurance. They definitely do. But to build to get there, it's not really necessary. So, the first thing that's really important to understand here is the dynamics of a 100-meter race, right? And, this is a quick graph that I just pulled out of a book, just to show that at 60 meters, the athletes at full speed. And this is a really advanced sprinter. The majority of athletes are going to be at full speed, probably at 40 meters, probably earlier, which means that to qualify as true speed training, the reps need to be in that 30 to 40 meter range, 50 meter range of high quality, right? And that's what I mean by lazy coaching doesn't seem like a lot of volume. So I'll just give a quick example because I think a lot of people really appreciate something that's concrete. This is a simple program. This is a program I probably used when developing some athletes in high school, probably most of the athletes I had in high school, grade 9 to 10. 2 days a week, acceleration development, speed development. On the Monday, it's, 8 times 30, 4 times 10 step up jumps. On the Friday, it's, a bit of a speed ladder going up to 50 meters, 4 times 10 step up jumps. Really simple. Seems lazy. This is a fantastic program. Might not seem that way, but the simplicity and the intensity of this helps develop the athlete in those very particular areas. Competition is going to fill in a lot of the rest of the stuff. And it's not until they get a lot older that they necessarily will need to develop the more complex energy systems, and they can get into a lot more very complicated training programs. Really simple, right? Grade 11 and 12. So you can progress up. Things should be of a progressive nature, especially, an athlete coming from grade 9, grade 10, really going through puberty and then kind of settling into themselves. What changes? Well, I add an extra day, 3 days of speed training, right? Still focusing predominantly on acceleration training. So you see 2 acceleration days, 1 speed day. It's really straightforward. This programming is basically what I used with every high school sprinter I coached, even all the way up to like 400 meter athletes. And, there was never a deficiency of speed endurance because the high school, especially in the high school season, you compete so much in your events, like 400, 200, that you build up great speed endurance just by doing those rounds. And so, this program is sufficient enough to develop, a 10.7 second 100 meter male sprinter or a 12.2 second 100 meter female sprinter. So, it's important to think about everything that goes into those programs and how it can be really simplified, and how sometimes the excess in programming is what holds athletes back, and especially multi-sport athletes. We'll talk about that in the next slide here, but I just wanted to share this table. And so before we were talking about the microcycle, which is like the week. So you could see Monday, Friday, or Monday, Wednesday, Friday. This would be like the year. So just thinking about progressions throughout a year, because, again, it wouldn't just be that program all year round. You can change things. You can always do more volume at certain times of the year, less during other times of the year, change the focus, change the emphasis, right? And so, this is just a basic overview of what the difference in progression could look like between grade 9, grade 10, 11, and 12, right? So, the first thing, I'll just kind of highlight the kind of key points here. But, September, October, November, December, it could be no real training. Take a lot of time off, play another sport, come into training in January. And then, like I wrote, focus on acceleration development. Speed can come a little later. You can emphasize that a little bit more later. And then there's competitions, and then great, you're off, right? So here I've just put the total amount of training months. And so, if you look at the progression, it just goes from, okay, well, next year we're going to do a little bit more. We're going to train for not necessarily more volume, but more time in the year. The next year, it's the same thing, more time in the year. You're going to train more consistently throughout the year. And finally in the last year, it's kind of the most, you're getting really close to a full calendar year. By the time that athletes go on to university, they're probably, in a really, really intense program. But, it starts off hills, acceleration, take a month off, acceleration, speed, compete indoors, right? I think it's important that at some point for athletes to have the maximal success that they train year round. That doesn't mean train all year. It just means that there's 2 seasons to the year. Again, when we think about the high school season, it's very short. It's at the start of summer, start to extend that out. Let's compete in June, July, try to make legions or something. Then you can start to build in the opposite direction into the winter. Start training in the winter. And it doesn't have to be complicated. And especially with sprints, you can train in a gymnasium. And again, because it's acceleration, it actually makes it even better. You don't need much distance. You can train 20 meters, 30 meters, depending on how long, a hallway is or an indoor soccer facility. Acceleration and speed or jumps, they kind of lend themselves to those environments. So it's really important to have those kind of training objectives throughout the winter. And it needs to progress year on year. Now, it doesn't have to be exactly like this. And again, it's good to be lazy, right? So if an athlete's playing another sport and they say, I can't make practice on this day, that's fine. I can't go to that competition. That's okay. It's not a big deal, right? You're just letting them be serious about track in the future. You're holding that kind of in reserve. We're not going to put the big stress on you until the future when some athletes will progress to that level. So, it's important to think about multi-sport athletes too, because it's, and if we're following the LTAD, you want athletes to compete in multiple sports as they develop. As they get towards, grade 11 and 12, you kind of want them to back off a bit. So, I think it's really important to modify training weeks based on the athlete's practice schedule in their other sports or their competition schedules in other sports. And it really comes down to a fundamental understanding of intensity and recovery, right? So, in grade 9, it's probably a little less intensity because they're not quite as good. You can get away with, 2 sprint practices a week, no problem, and having soccer 4 times a week. That's probably okay. There might be a day where, practice is the day after a soccer game, and that athlete is going to be slow, right? Because they played a big game and they played for 4 hours or whatever. It's just, it's really important to have the understanding of what recovery means, even in the high school sense. And they can have that day off. Again, be a lazy coach in a sense. You want the athlete at their best most practices, fairly fresh enough to produce quality training outputs. And so having, dead legs from practice, I had an athlete, I remember when I was coaching the high school level, came from soccer practice to track practice. And so I said, you're not going to get anything out of this, not in a negative way, just saying, it's better if you just rested, go get some sleep. That's probably the better option because, the athlete's tired from that practice, right? So I think it's really critical to sit down with these athletes and look at their schedules and talk about what's best, if it's possible to, have some wiggle room there, depending on facility availability. If not, it's okay for an athlete to train once a week, in grade 9. And then if they're getting better and they're more serious about it, then it's about making a decision as to, well, if I really want to excel at track, maybe I have to cut a sport out. Maybe I have to focus on track. And I think around grade 10 is probably the time to have that conversation with athletes, grade 10, grade 11, about potentially focusing on track or focusing on their top two sports, because it can make a big difference in their results. And I'll show you some evidence that suggests that that's the case. So, really try to understand that there's a lot of demands going on in these athletes' lives, and, track's a small part of it. And, being empathetic and just kind of manipulating the week and manipulating the training is a really smart thing to do for these athletes. So I just had some examples here. I just went through some old data for two athletes that I coached from high school to university, and they had some success university. And again, not every athlete has success, and that's not the path for every athlete. I've coached, 50 to 70 high school athletes, and only a handful of them were really successful. The key is that the principles for each athlete and the progression of each athlete are the same. And so, I always wanted the best for each athlete. And some of them chose ultimately not to do track. Some of them were demotivated because they were in it for the wrong reasons, or whatever. That's okay. So this was a female sprinter that I coached through high school, grade 10, 11, 12, first year university, second year university, and just the overall progression of the 100 meters. And these two examples are really important because when it comes down to motivation and how you motivate, how your program motivates the athletes is really critical. This athlete at the start in grade 10 was running 14.8, just nothing special, right? Got lost in the crowd at city meet, and then very motivated intrinsically. So she trained, throughout the year. Again, it's another tactic to, improve, train longer, not necessarily more volume, but just train more. And that athlete improved a lot. Same thing the next year, right? So you're seeing a little bit of momentum build. Okay, I'm gonna train a little bit more. I'm gonna train a little bit more. Let's travel over here for competition. That's really exciting. That's really motivating. Okay, now we have a good social group, and my peers are doing very similar things, right? So it's not just one athlete that's going to compete at these competitions, and multiple athletes, right? So it's a big friend group. There's a lot of people. It's really supportive, right? And so, that allowed that athlete to kind of stick with it and stay motivated and continue to improve, and, had a really successful university career. Same thing with Matt here. And this was actually really shocking when I look back. I didn't realize how slow Matt was in grade 10. He was really slow. And I looked at a number of results, and I found 12.2, something I found, 12.0. Really surprising. And, he's a really interesting case where he played hockey until grade 10. He stopped playing hockey in grade 11, or going into grade 11. And it made a massive difference, right? Because you're splitting your energy between different areas. And it's not to go against the principle of kind of diversification in training, where you should absolutely develop your skill set in a number of sports. Eventually, that diversification plays against you. And in my experience, it's around 10th or 11th grade where things start to become much more intense in nature. And so, yeah, Matt chose track over hockey because he wasn't that great at hockey. And it made a big difference in the improvements that he was able to make. But again, it's being able to see an improvement. You know, if we didn't have that conversation about not doing hockey, maybe we would run 11-7 and just be like, you know what, this is not for me. I'm not getting any better. I'm losing. A lot of people are beating me. You know, so I think it's really critical that athletes will make different decisions based on their results and how things progress. And if you really look back, it's tied to the programming, it's tied to, you know, the group dynamic, it's tied to everything that gets done within that group moving forward. So just something that's really key. And that's something that, as I look back, it's really important. Yeah, this is kind of the end of my planned discussion here. I wanted to leave it open to questions and discussions. I think some of the best comments are probably more discussion items. And